practically nothing, but I was trying to keep within my time element. So I thought it would be a good idea to have this conference to go over these things in greater detail. First of all, the term ecclesiology means the theology of the church. Ecclesia means church. So ecclesiology is what is the church? What is the nature of the church? What is it? That's what ecclesiology answers. It's the question. And the traditional ecclesiology, if you have read the second column of what I handed out, is very, very clear and straightforward. You don't have to be a theologian to understand it. All you need to know is your catechism. And that is that Christ founded a church. And that church is an organized society under the leadership and primacy of St. Peter, and who is the head of the whole church, including the bishops, and that this single organized society is the one true Church of Christ. It is the mystical body of Christ. It is the unique means of salvation. It's the only way in which you can get to heaven. You must belong to it in order to go to heaven. And that outside of the church, there is no salvation. That means there is no other airline you can take, so to speak. That participation in any other religion, belonging to any other religion, will not bring you to heaven, but will bring you to the other place. That is the teaching of the church. It's very simple. If you read the second column, it all says the same thing, what I just said. It identifies, therefore, Church of Christ with the Roman Catholic Church, with the mystical body of Christ, the church, when it talks about the church, capital C, and the universal church. All of those things in the traditional ecclesiology, which is set forth by these popes. And by the way, these are quotes only from the 19th century on. I haven't got into the other 18th centuries or 17th centuries. This is only from the 19th century on what you see here. This continuous doctrine. All of those things are exactly the same thing. It's as if you were talking about a single rock. It's the Church of Christ, it's the Roman Catholic Church, it's the mystical body of Christ, it's the church, it's the universal church. It's a single thing. There is no distinction to make. If you are outside of it, you are a withered branch, as one pope said, that you have no possibility of salvation, and so forth. Now, here we must make the distinction that if you are outside the church through no fault of your own, right, and you belong to the church by desire, that is, where you want to be part of it, but for some reason, through no fault of your own, you cannot become a part of it, but you want to be a part of it, that type of belonging is sufficient for salvation. Right? The church teaches that. Okay? So, we're not speaking about that in ecclesiology. We're not speaking about people who are in error through no fault of their own. We're speaking about what is the church? What does it consist of? What is it? Is it the unique means of salvation? Those are the two big questions. Now, the reason why the Novus Ordo came up with a new ecclesiology was because of ecumenism. In order to understand Vatican II, you must understand that there was a push for ecumenism. And it goes back, if you read some of my Catholic Restoration articles, it goes back to the Protestant Reformation itself. Because the Protestant Reformation said that the rule of faith is individual interpretation of sacred scripture. You pick up the Bible and you figure out what God said. Well, the obvious from that in the practical order is that everyone starts fighting over what God is saying in sacred Scripture. And that's exactly what happened in Protestantism. Whereas Catholicism has always retained a unity of faith because the rule of faith in the Catholic Church is the teaching of the Catholic Church. It is not individual interpretation of anything. It is the teaching of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church teaches a single thing. You adhere to it, you are Catholic. If you don't adhere to it, you are not Catholic. It's very simple. But in the Protestant religion, faith is an interior trust of God and is therefore not connected to dogma. See, in the Protestant religion, you have faith if you trust God. You could all disagree amongst yourselves about what God teaches, but they would say you have faith. In the Catholic Church, if you disagree with what the Catholic Church teaches, you don't have the faith, because the faith is ordered to dogma. Your faith has collapsed, just like 9/11, just right down to the ground. If you make an exception of a single dogma and say, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that, the whole thing collapses. Why? Because you destroy the motive of faith, the foundation of faith, which is adhering to what God teaches based on the authority of God revealing and the proposition of this teaching by the Catholic Church. So just as you see a gumball machine, the gumballs, that represents revelation. But what dispenses revelation to you is the Catholic Church, just as the machine dispenses the gumball to you. So the role of the Catholic Church is to dispense, to hand out revelation. Just as the role of the waiter in a restaurant is to hand you the food, but he doesn't necessarily make it. It is God who reveals, it is the church that proposes. And so the rule of faith is to believe what the church proposes, what the Catholic Church teaches, because the Catholic Church has, by the command of Christ and the power of Christ, the power to teach. Going therefore, teach ye all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Whosoever shall not believe shall be condemned. Now, how could you be condemned if those apostles did not have the authority to teach? See, it doesn't make any sense that our Lord would attach a condemnation to those who do not believe unless those apostles had the power of God to teach. And so the Catholic Church has always maintained that it has the power of God to teach in God's name, and therefore you must assent to the teaching of the Catholic Church. The Protestants don't believe that. And so they had the problem of a whole bunch of people calling themselves Christians who didn't believe the same thing, and who split themselves up into various different sects, and all fighting one amongst the other on matters of faith. On matters of faith. And so the Protestants always had this idea of a generic Christianity, ecumenism, that we're all Christians, we're all part of the Church of Christ, even though we differ on matters of faith. So if you are a Presbyterian, you can go into a Methodist church or a Lutheran church and you will be considered a Christian, even though you are not a part of the Lutheran church or the Presbyterian church or whatever, Methodist church. They distinguish, therefore, faith and Christianity from the organization of the church. See, the organization is a different thing. The corporation of the Lutheran Church, or that body as a corporate entity, is different from your faith and is different from Christianity. That is not true in Catholicism. You cannot separate the body, the corporate body of the church from Christianity. It is the same thing. It is the Christian church. And that's why Pope Pius XII says in here, to be Christian is to be Roman. To be Christian is to be Roman. Yes. It's a beautiful quote. Pope Pius XII, Allocution to the Irish Pilgrims, October 8, 1957. It's on page 8. To be Christian, one must be Roman. One must recognize the oneness of Christ's church that is governed by one successor of the Prince of the Apostles, who is the Bishop of Rome, Christ's vicar on earth. Christianity and Romanism are the same thing. To be Christian, one must be Roman. And then I comment, therefore, those who are not Roman are not Christians. Those who do not recognize the oneness of Christ's church that is governed by the Roman Pontiff are not Christians. Now, it is true that they are referred to as Christians, but strictly speaking, they are not. As in my first discussion with Dr. Fastiggi, he said, are they Christians? I said, strictly speaking, they're not. No. They're heretics. They're heretics or schismatics. A heretic is someone who is baptized validly, but who differs according to faith. He denies the faith. A schismatic is one who is baptized validly, but who has separated from the Roman Pontiff. So the proper term is not Christian, as if they are in some way part of the true Church of Christ. The proper term is heretic, which includes the fact that they're baptized, or schismatic, that includes the fact that they're baptized, but it excludes them from belonging to the true Church of Christ, the Roman Catholic Church. That's the proper term. And so the Church prays on Good Friday, let us pray for the heretics and the schismatics. It doesn't say let us pray for the separated brethren, or the new one, I'm sure. That's the term. And that's the traditional ecclesiology. It's very clear. That's the whole thing. As I said, all you need is a catechism to understand that. See? But the new ecclesiology was done in order to be able to go to the Greek Orthodox and to the Protestants and say, you are in some way part of the Church of Christ. They speak of partial communion and full communion, which is a Protestant term. It was suggested by the Protestant theologian Oscar Kuhlmann to Cardinal Bea. So they were searching for ways to be able to approach the Lutherans or be able to approach the schismatics and say, we regard you as having a certain value in the Church of Christ, that you have a certain place in the Church of Christ. You are not merely a withered branch, as the traditional ecclesiology would say. That you've fallen off the true vine and you're rotting on the ground, and the only thing that you have in common with the Catholic Church is the appearance, as St. Augustine said. Because a branch, when it's withering on the ground, has still the appearance of being what it was, a true branch, but it is no longer a true branch. It doesn't have any feeling or life in it. That's St. Augustine, and that's in there. Yes, one of the popes quoted it. It's in this. So the new ecclesiology is motivated by ecumenism. The four great errors of Vatican II, and I say great because there are others, but the four great errors of Vatican II are ecumenism first, that there is a certain value to non-Catholic religions, that they have a certain validity, a certain legitimacy, and that they are in a certain way a means of salvation. Because of that, they had to change the ecclesiology to say that non-Catholic churches are in some way part of the Church of Christ, and that they are means of salvation. They had to change the doctrine of the papacy. And so Vatican II says that the subject of the authority of the church, of the supreme authority of the church, is the college of bishops, of which Peter is the head. Now that's, if you analyze, let me get you the exact quote. And it was done also essentially to do away with the papacy. Because the idea of the church as a papal monarchy is something that was absolutely unbearable from the point of view of the Protestants. So the papacy had to be changed. Let me see if I can find the exact quote. This college of bishops, this is Lumen Gentium, insofar as it is composed of many, expresses the variety and universality of the people of God, but insofar as it is assembled under one head, the supreme authority with which this college is empowered over the whole church is exercised in a solemn way through an ecumenical council. Is a more clear statement to it. But anyway, and that's a whole other speech. But that's one of the things, is Ecclesiology, to eliminate the Roman Pontiff, effectively eliminate the Roman Pontiff. And that's exactly what they've done. If you notice, the John Paul II feels that he has exercised and sufficed in his office if he merely says something, if he merely makes a verbal correction of what is going on. There are unbelievable scandals, things that you don't even know about, doctrinal scandals. And for him it is sufficient if there is some sort of document or comment or something that, well, that's not good. And that is the Queen Elizabeth approach to the papacy, which is exactly what they want. That is, in order to please the Protestants and the Orthodox, they have to reduce the papacy to essentially what Queen Elizabeth is to England. Someone who has absolutely no power, but who occasionally might say something edifying or might make a comment. But they continue to appoint and maintain in positions of so-called authority bishops who are absolutely deplorable. This goes on and on and on. And if you see the condition of the church today, if you are scandalized by it, it's because these appointments are being made all the time, and because he is one of those bishops who agrees with that. They simply see a certain need for Rome to put the brakes on the progress of the church. And they say something, and then they fold their hands, and life goes on. And that is intentional, and they've even spoken about it. Cardinal Ratzinger said a number of years ago in his speech to Protestants, we don't know what the papacy will be in the future. They call it the Petrine ministry. the papacy had to be reduced from the monarchical papacy of pre-Vatican II times, where the Pope was, if any of you are old enough to recall, and I won't ask, but if any of you are old enough to recall, Pope Pius XII was somebody, just the very mention of the name would be, you would just tingle with the idea of the Roman Pontiff, a person who was both so holy and so powerful, was in the church, the supreme head, the king. See, whereas now, with JP2 running around in headdresses and having naked women in front of him and everything, the papacy has been completely destroyed. It is practically a joke. But in any case, that's the reason for it. The other big error is religious liberty. And religious liberty was enacted and decreed because you can't go to someone and say, you don't have the freedom to be a Protestant. See, the Catholic Church always said that error has no rights. It's the teaching of the Catholic Church. It's the teaching of Leo XIII. It's the teaching of Pius IX. All the popes. Error has no rights. You don't have a right to be an error. Error is a fault of the mind. It's a sin of the mind. You don't have a right to embrace something which is contrary to the truth of God, whether it's a natural truth or a supernatural truth, but especially a supernatural truth. You don't have a right to embrace heresy, because right comes from God, and God could not, it would be against his essence, could not give you a right to do something contrary to him. He cannot give you a right to sin. He cannot say to you, today you can rob a bank, it's okay. It's like one day a year you can rob a bank. He can't do that. He remains forever the same. He can't say to you, well, you have a right to be a Protestant. You have no right to be a Protestant. The Church has always said that in certain countries, especially where there's a lot of diversity of religions, that false religions may be tolerated in order to avoid civil war or other strife and so forth, other problems. And the Church always, even in her own lands, not always, but most of the time, in her own lands, tolerated the Jews. They were not permitted to build synagogues. The synagogue in Rome, for example, only this year, a few months ago, celebrated its 100th anniversary because it was built after Garibaldi and the Freemasons took over in Rome. That's one of the first Jewish synagogues built in Rome. The first Protestant churches. If you go to Rome, you look at the Protestant churches, they all date from the early 19th century. Early 20th century, end of the 19th. There's no Baroque churches, Baroque Protestant churches. There's no churches from the 1700s or 1800s, 18th century or 17th century. It's all from the 19th century and 20th century. That is after the fall of Pius IX as the King of Rome and the takeover by the Freemasons, Garibaldi and the House of Savoy, who were thoroughly steeped, soaked in Freemasonry, and very anti-Catholic. And so what happened a few months ago when they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the synagogue? Sure enough, a communique went over from the Vatican congratulating the Jews on their 100th anniversary of the synagogue. And they sent someone, a Vatican official, to be present at and congratulate the building of a mosque in Rome. That was a number of years ago. See, so you can't do ecumenism by coming and telling somebody, you don't even have a right to be a Protestant. You don't have a right to be an Islamic. You don't have the right to be a Jew in God's eyes. You don't have any right to do that. You can't do ecumenism. So all of the error of Vatican II goes back to that problem of ecumenism. Ecumenism is like a virus in your computer. It gets into all of your files and ruins them. And ecumenism gets into all of the dogmas of the Catholic Church and ruins them. because it takes away from them their truth. They no longer exclude their opposite. See, everything's negotiable. We can all be Christians even though we disagree on matters of faith. It doesn't exclude the opposite. Because truth, by its very nature, excludes the opposite, just as light excludes darkness. If the light is on, you don't have darkness. If you have darkness, the light is not on. If you have the truth, it excludes the darkness of error. And that's why in the prayer on Friday night, I would say, Christ the King, we call Islam and idolatry darkness. Those who labor in the darkness of Islam and idolatry. That's the traditional ecclesiology. That's the traditional faith. That's darkness. And it's so simple and clear, and it makes so much sense. Of course, if this is supernatural truth, if Christ is God, if he has established a church, it makes all the sense in the world that all the things that I just said are true. But now let's get to the new ecclesiology, and this won't be long. The only thing is that I warn you that the Ratzinger is no fool, nor is John Paul II. They are very much aware of this second column, probably more aware than we are, because they know that they have to walk on eggs in order to avoid the accusation of heresy. They are presenting what is heretical doctrine, but they are always couching it in gobbledygook. And so it is difficult at times to pin them to a single thing, to make them define what they're saying. And so, whereas when you read the second column, it's crystal clear, you read the first column and it's fog. Well, what's this and what's that? There are two documents. They're available on the Vatican website if you want to see them. One is Communion from 1992, the Church understood as communion. The other is the Declaration Dominus Jesus from 2000. Both are by Ratzinger, and both are approved by John Paul II, so you can't say it's just Ratzinger's opinion. And that talks about the new ecclesiology. And in these documents, there's about 4 churches floating around. And you don't know exactly, they never define exactly what is what. He talks about the church. He talks about the Catholic Church. He talks about the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of the Creed. He talks about the Church of Christ, and he talks about the Universal Church. He does not define those things. Those terms float in and out. And that is actually a form of fallacy in our philosophy book. One of the forms of fallacy is to make a statement that is gobbledygook. Is to purposely entwine and entangle what you're saying in such a way as to not be clear. That is a way of promoting error, which is fallacy. And they do it all the time, and I know that young priest was a little bit perturbed by the fact that I call this theology gobbledygook. But it's true. Read it and ask yourself if it is not true. So I just want to point out what their ecclesiology is. This is from the 1992 document, The Church Understood as Communion. He says, and I'm reading here, the Church of Christ, which we profess in the Creed to be the one Holy Catholic to be one Holy Catholic and Apostolic, is the universal church. So he's saying the Church of Christ, which is the Church of the Creed, is the universal church. Okay, so those 3 things are the same. That is the worldwide community of the disciples of the Lord. Who are the disciples of the Lord? Which is present and active amid the particular characteristics and the diversity of persons, groups, times, and places. Among these manifold particular expressions, you see what I mean by gobbledygook, of the saving presence of the one Church of Christ, there are to be found from the times of the apostles on those entities which are in themselves churches, capital C. Because although they are particular, the universal church becomes present in them with all her essential elements. So he introduces the idea of particular churches. In the traditional ecclesiology, a particular church is a diocese. It's a diocese. It is a part of the universal church. So there's the Church of Detroit, or there's the Church of Milan, or the Church of Paris. Those are the particular churches. They are in union with the Roman Pontiff. It's very clear and simple. I can say it in one sentence. But wait. They, meaning the particular churches, are therefore constituted, quote, after the model of the universal church, and each of them is, quote, a portion of the people of God, which is yet another term, entrusted to a bishop to be guided by him with the assistance of his clergy. Then he says in the very next section, the universal church is therefore the body of the churches. So there's a body of all of these particular churches, and that's the universal church. Okay? In the next section, number 9, he says, in order to grasp the true meaning of the analogical application of the term communion to the particular churches taken as a whole, one must bear in mind, above all, that the particular churches, insofar as they are part of the one Church of Christ, have a special relationship of mutual interiority. I told you gobbledygook. With the whole, that is interiority, with the whole, that is the universal church, because in every particular church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ is truly present and active. Keep that in mind. In every particular church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ is truly present and active. Okay? In paragraph 10, he says, whoever belongs to one particular church belongs to all the churches, since belonging to the communion, like belonging to the church, is never simply particular, but by its nature is always universal. Okay? Then, in paragraph 17, which is ecclesial communion and ecumenism, he says, the church knows that she is joined in many ways to the baptized who are honored by the name of Christian, remember what Pius XII says, but who do not, however, profess the Catholic faith in its entirety. That means they don't profess it at all. Because if you remove a single dogma, as I said, the whole building collapses, and the popes say that's in there. Among the non-Catholic churches, I'm quoting from Ratzinger, and Christian communities, there are indeed to be found many elements of the Church of Christ, which allow us, amid joy and hope, to acknowledge the existence of a certain communion, albeit imperfect. This communion exists especially with the Eastern Orthodox churches, which, though separated from the See of Peter, remain united to the Catholic Church by means of very close bonds. They are united to the Catholic Church by means of very close bonds, even though they are not submitted to St. Peter. Such as apostolic succession and a valid Eucharist, and therefore merit the title of particular churches. So he's saying that the Eastern Orthodox schismatics are particular churches, and everything that we just said about particular churches, that they pertain to the universal church, the Church of Christ, and the Church of the Creed, one holy and apostolic. Remember he said that in the beginning. Now he's saying these are particular churches. It cannot get more explicit. And so therefore you have a new ecclesiology which contradicts the traditional, which is that the Church of Christ has, as part of itself, these schismatic, non-Catholic churches, which are not submitted to the Roman Pontiff, which disagree with the Catholic Church on matters of faith, such as the Immaculate Conception, such as filioque in the Creed, and other things, purgatory among them, divorce and remarriage. They disagree on all of those things, yet they are part of the Church of Christ, which is the universal church, which is the Church of the Creed. They are particular churches. It's right here. You can get it on the Vatican website. I am not in any way misrepresenting what they are saying. That's one of the points I wanted to make. And I thought that Dr. Fastiggi was going to get up and give me thunder and lightning for misrepresenting them. If I had been on their side, I would have done that. In other words, I would have just gone for the jugular vein right away and say, you have misrepresented us. And, from their point of view, they would have had a strong position to argue in the sense that, we know what we're talking about. But they have nothing, because they know it's true. What I just said is true. I mean, he really did not even address my accusation against them. That would have been the first thing to do. The second thing for him to have done would be to say there is continuity between this new ecclesiology and the traditional, and everything that you say on this is all wet. That would have been the proper mode of attack against me. Right? He didn't even begin to do that. When I saw where he was going, I just put my head in my hands and go, this is going to be a big waste of time tonight. It was entertaining, though, as I said it would be, but it was a waste of time from the point of view of achieving the truth. The other is Dominus Jesus. Because there was the modernist theologians went crazy with this kind of new ecclesiology. Ratzinger attempts to pull them in a little bit, and he makes a number of statements whereby he tries to temper the new ecclesiology. But he doesn't really, actually. He affirms it again. Everything that he said in that document, he says in this. The Catholic faithful, he says, are required to profess that there is an historical continuity rooted in apostolic succession between the church founded by Christ and the Catholic Church. This is the single Church of Christ, which our Savior, after his resurrection, entrusted to Peter's pastoral care, commissioning him and the other apostles to extend and rule her, erected for all ages as the pillar and mainstay of truth. That sounds very nice. See? The Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. That sounds beautiful. Very happy. Now, this church, constituted and organized as a society in the present world, subsists in the Catholic Church, governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. That's a direct quote from Vatican II. Now, why subsists in? Pius XII said is. What was wrong with this Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. What's wrong with that? But you see what they're doing. They're saying that there is an invisible Church of Christ, a big, something united by invisible bonds, but it is in its organizational existence. As a body, it's the Catholic Church. So it's as if the body of the Catholic Church and the Church of Christ are two different things. Otherwise, you wouldn't say it that way. The next thing should have been, this church is the Catholic Church. The Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. But they want to distinguish the Church of Christ from the organized Catholic Church as an organized body, as if those are two different things. Wait. He says, with the expression subsisted in, the Second Vatican Council sought to harmonize two doctrinal statements. On the one hand, that the Church of Christ, despite the divisions which exist among Christians, continues to exist fully only in the Catholic Church, implying it exists partially in the other churches. And on the other hand, that outside of her structure, many elements can be found of sanctification and truth. That is, in those churches and ecclesial communities which are not yet in full communion with the Catholic Church. But with respect to these, it needs to be stated that they derive their efficacy from the very fullness of grace and truth entrusted to the Catholic Church. He says, therefore, there exists a single Church of Christ which subsists in the Catholic Church, governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. The churches which, while not existing in perfect communion with the Catholic Church, remain united to her by means of the closest bonds, that is, by apostolic succession and a valid Eucharist, are true particular churches. Therefore, the Church of Christ is present and operative also in these churches, meaning the false churches, even though they lack full communion with the Catholic Church, since they do not accept the Catholic doctrine of the primacy, which, according to the will of God, the Bishop of Rome objectively has and exercises over the entire Church. Then he says, in order to avoid something that was condemned previously, he says, the Christian faithful are therefore not permitted to imagine that the Church of Christ is nothing more than a collection, divided yet in some way one, of churches and ecclesial communities. Nor are they free to hold that today the Church of Christ nowhere really exists and must be considered only as a goal which all churches and ecclesial communities must strive to reach. These separated churches and communities as such, though we believe they suffer from defects, have by no means been deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation. So in the earlier document, he said that this universal church, which is the Church of Christ, which is the Church of the Creed, is the body of the churches, meaning the particular churches. Now he's saying, well, it's not just a collection. What is it? Define it. If it's the body of the churches, how can you say this then? See, because what happens is that the theologians read him and draw the conclusions, and then they write all this heretical ecclesiology, and then they get upset. And then they go back and say these things which really don't make any sense. So those are those documents. But what is the coup de grace is something we found on the internet this week, which is one paragraph from Cardinal Casper. This is 2001. He was speaking to September 4th, speaking to an ecumenical group in Spain. And this is beautiful. The crucial point was that the council no longer stated the Catholic Church is the Church of Jesus Christ, i.e., it was no longer stated the Catholic Church and the Church of Jesus Christ are identical. Beautiful. The council defined the matter more carefully. It said the Church of Jesus Christ subsisted in the Catholic Church. That is, it is actually being realized and is present in the Catholic Church, but outside of its visible structure, there are also elements of the Church of Christ, which in the case of the Oriental and Orthodox churches are even true churches. They're true churches. We call them sister churches. The decree on ecumenism even goes as far as to say the Holy Ghost uses these churches and Christian communities as means for the salvation of their members. Get ready. He says, outside the Catholic Church there is salvation too. There are saints and martyrs. So you have two explicit heresies and he's a member of the Curia. two explicit heresies that the Church of Christ is not exactly the same thing as the Catholic Church. See, the Council no longer stated the Catholic Church is the Church of Jesus Christ. That's a heresy. It's like saying Christ is not God. It's a heresy. No distinctions to make about it. The other heresy is outside the church. There is salvation. It's right there in black and white. That's I can give you the website address if you want that too. So that's the difference between the traditional and no sort of ecclesiology. The next question was whether these churches are means of salvation, and you heard me say from there that they are means of salvation. Vatican II said that they are means of salvation. John Paul II said they are means of salvation in his encyclical Catechesi Tradendae of 1980, talking about catechizing people, that you should tell them that non-Catholic religions are means of salvation. Yes, page 15. It is extremely important to give a correct and fair presentation of other churches and ecclesial communities that the Spirit of Christ does not refrain from using as means of salvation. Now, means of salvation means that it is a way to get to heaven. That just as you use a knife and a fork, or as an airplane pilot uses an aircraft. So, using the analogy of the aircraft. If the Holy Ghost is the pilot, the church is the aircraft. Now, can the Holy Ghost use a non-Catholic church as an aircraft that will bring you to your destination? If you're, say, flying to Paris, which is what I use. Would you get on an airplane, for example, that had only elements of an airplane? That had no brakes, or which had no engines, or which had no tail, let's say, but had certain elements. See, that's their point, is that because these churches have certain elements of the Catholic Church, they can be considered means of salvation. What are those elements? A valid baptism. But as I pointed out to Dr. Fastiggi, a valid baptism doesn't get you to heaven. A valid baptism puts you in the state of sanctifying grace, but you have to do a lot more after you're baptized in order to get to heaven. And one of those things, which is necessary for salvation, is to profess the one true faith and to be a part of the true Church of Christ, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And if you knowingly and willfully neglect that, to do that, you go to hell, despite your valid baptism, despite whatever other truths or valid Holy Eucharist or whatever you know about the Catholic faith or anything. You go to hell for neglecting to make yourself a part of what is the unique means of salvation. That's the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church. You can see that in those in that second column. It's just loaded. Gregory XVI, he who is separated from the body of the Catholic Church, however laudable his conduct may otherwise seem, will never enjoy eternal life, and the anger of God remains on him by reason of the crime of which he is guilty in living separated from Christ. How can you do ecumenism with that statement? The Holy Universal Church, quoting St. Gregory the Great, this is Gregory the 16th, quoting St. Gregory the Great, that's page 15. The Holy Universal Church teaches that God cannot be truly adored except within its fold, She affirms that all those who are separated from her will not be saved. Pius IX, outside her fold, the true church is one, holy, Catholic, apostolic, and Roman. Notice Roman. Unique, the chair founded on Peter by the Lord's words. Outside her fold is to be found neither the true faith nor eternal salvation. So how can we say that we have a unity of faith with other religions? Neither true faith nor eternal salvation. The reason is, if you deny a single dogma, you don't have true faith. And it goes on and on. You can read that yourself. It's perpetual. And that's only since the 19th century. So the means of that there is means of salvation outside the Catholic Church is a heresy. That they may use things that are means of grace, such as a valid sacrament, is not heresy. If a Greek Orthodox priest preaches a sermon on the real presence, that could be an external grace. That happens all the time. They teach their catechism. That's known as an external grace. In the sense that it leads you to a knowledge of a supernatural truth. Nobody's denying that. That's like getting a stabilizer on the plane. It's very nice that you have that, but that's not going to get you down the runway and off to Paris, where you get a wheel. That's very nice that you have that, but it's not a means of salvation. That's the key, and they like to confuse those things. Another aspect of the is the Roman Pontiff as an essential element. You see, Ratzinger says that these churches are wounded. I put that in there. These churches are wounded because they're not submitted to the Roman Pontiff. And that's an interesting word. If you are wounded, you remain alive and whole, but you have a problem. You're ill. So a wounded church, as I say here, is one which may be accidentally impaired, which you would have if you cut yourself, burn yourself, and a church that is even imperfect, but one which is nevertheless substantially integral. You are still a human being. And even if you're shot, you're still a human being. When this simple analysis of common sense is applied to Ratzinger's statement, it means that the repudiation of submission to the Roman Pontiff does not cause separation from the true church, which would be ecclesial death, but rather only a wound, an accidental imperfection. Accidental in the sense that it does not ruin the essence. By analogy, the human nature, after original sin, has all of its constitutive metaphysical and physical parts, essence and existence, body and soul, together with all of its proper faculties, both of body and of soul, but is wounded, that is, has a difficulty in correctly performing the acts of the faculties due to the effects of original sin. That is the traditional theology of original sin, wounded but integral. And see, when we see that, when we are trained in theology, and we see that word wounded, right away you think of the traditional doctrine of original sin, which is that the human nature is wounded but integral. It is impaired, but it is not ruined. So, that's another heresy, is that somehow you can be part of the true Church of Christ without being submitted to the Roman Pontiff. And you see that that trashes the primacy of the Roman Pontiff. And as I said, it's ironic that we who were accused over and over again of being schismatics and going to hell, which I thought was ironic because it was so anti-ecumenical. His whole presentation was a good sermon on hell, and we were going there. That we are the ones asserting the Roman primacy as an essential element of the Catholic Church. Therefore, if you take away the essence, or an element which is essential, the whole thing is ruined. If I take away your essential element of your soul, if I take away your intellect, you are no longer the same thing. It's an essential element of your soul. So, and then just a few other things that he brought up. One thing he brought up was St. Justin Martyr and the seeds of the word. There's a text in St. Justin Martyr where he talks about the seeds of the word. By the way, St. Justin Martyr is not a doctor of the church. Doctor of the church means that the church has examined everything that you have written and has declared that there is nothing contrary to faith in it. And while St. Justin Martyr is a saint, he is not a doctor of the church, which is significant because he did do some writings, and it's not to say that he said anything wrong, but it's just significant that he's not a doctor of the church. And I just want to bring that up because I love that passage of St. Justin. Let's see. The text is from Vatican II. Quote, "The fathers of the church rightly saw in the various religions, as they were so many reflections of the one truth, seeds of the word, attesting that though the roots taken may be different, there is but a single goal to which is directed the deepest aspiration of human spirit as expressed in its quest for God, and also in its quest through its tending towards God for the full dimension of its humanity, or in other words, for the full meaning of human life." I told you, gobbledygook. That's Vatican II. So that loves this text of St. Justin. But this text of St. Justin, which is from his first apology, is not speaking about the Greek religion. He's not speaking about the polytheistic religions of the Greeks. Rather, he says, those who lived in conformity to the Word are Christians, even though they have been considered atheists, such as, among the Greeks, Socrates, Heraclitus, and others like them, and among the foreigners, Abraham. Right? And there is even St. Justin says, everything that the philosophers and legislators discovered and expressed well, they accomplished through their discovery and contemplation of some part of the Word. Right? He says, Socrates, the most ardent of all in this regard, who was accused of the very crimes imputed to us of not recognizing the gods of the city. And he says in another place, for each one of them seeing through his participation of the seminal divine word what was related to, spoke very well. So here, it is not a question of religion. He's not speaking about the false religions of the Greeks. He's speaking of philosophy as a preparation for divine truth. And the church has always said that. The church uses Aristotle as the means of proving the existence of God. The church has always recognized natural truths in philosophy. It's because he believes that all religions have, in a certain way, a seed of God. You know, there's something supernatural about all religions. That's why he permits the idolatry, even the idolatry, the worship of fire in the basilica or in the courtyard of the Basilica of Assisi, because even in idolatry there is a certain tending toward God. That's ecumenism. That's the soul of ecumenism. And therefore everything is in a certain way and to a certain extent true and supernaturally true. It would not be false to say that there are certain elements of natural truth in practically every religion. Even in the worship of fire, you could say, well, there's monotheism. There's a single God, and that's fire. You could say that. But that is not a supernatural truth which is going to bring you to eternal salvation. Not at all. Not at all. It is darkness. The religion as such is darkness. That's why it says in that prayer, the darkness of idolatry and of Islamism, because it contains falsehood. What is a means of salvation, and which is the true faith, and which is the true Church of Christ, is something which is without the blemish of any error. It is the whole truth, the integral supernatural truth. And if other religions have truth, it is either the effect of philosophical truth, something that you can reason to, or it is the effect of having stolen from revelation a supernatural truth. Something which does not pertain to them, something which was not given to them, but they took it. Just as if you stole your neighbor's car. To say that they have value or in some way merit a title of particular churches or something would be as absurd as you're going out and stealing a Ferrari and driving it into your driveway and then standing by it right in front of your neighbors and say, "Come out and look at my new car, isn't it beautiful?" It's as absurd as that. It's stolen. And Cardinal Mazzella says that. I should have brought that text. But he said they are the spolia in Latin, the spoils. Those are the true sacraments that they have and the whatever doctrines they have, he calls spolia, which means spoils, that they have taken from the Catholic Church, just as if you ransacked it. That's the attitude of the Catholic Church toward the non-Catholic religions, that whatever they have that's any good is either from reason, and anybody can get that, you don't need a religion for that, or it's borrowed from revelation, which is the property of the Catholic Church. It's stolen. And it doesn't do you any good, any more than a broken down plane does you any good for flying. And as I said, if you follow the instructions of a false religion, you're going to go to hell. Because you will be poisoned by the false doctrine. It's only if you have the excuse of ignorance before God that you will be excused. But if you don't have that excuse of ignorance, if you adhere to these things knowingly and willingly, you go to hell. Just as you go to hell for adultery and everything else, you go to hell for that. As a matter of fact, it is worse to offend God by indifference to His truth and by the embracing of error than it is to commit adultery, than it is to commit cold-blooded murder. Heresy is worse than cold-blooded murder. And so you go to a deeper part of hell for embracing heresy than you do for taking a gun to somebody's head in cold blood and shooting it. And just the final thing, I know we're a little over, was the point of inculturation. He brought up a Father Ricci, a Jesuit, in the 17th century. And remember I said, now I'll give you the whole story, the rest of the story. Well, the rest of the story is that when the church had its great missionary effort in the time of the discovery of the world in Africa and the Far East and all. So principally the 1500s and especially 1600s and 1700s, there was an immediate problem of culture. It was, how do we come from Portugal or France or Spain and preach to Chinese? Well, the first thing is we have to know their language. Secondly, our culture is going to be significantly different. Or how do we preach to Indians in Canada? They don't wear any clothing in the summertime, as an example. We don't know their language. They don't have a word in their vocabulary for God. This is what the North American martyrs found. They couldn't say, what's your word for God? They don't have one. So they had to make up the one who made all. And so there was an attempt to make the faith as palatable culturally as possible. And that principle in itself is very valid. St. Gregory the Great in sending St. Augustine of Canterbury to England, said, retain whatever you can. Whatever they have that is retainable in their culture, retain and Christianize. And the church always did that. And that's why you see a certain difference in Catholicism, accidental difference in Catholicism from nation to nation. The Catholicism of England and Ireland is much different from the Catholicism of Spain and Italy. England and Ireland have a very low-key, almost cold, unemotional culture in the faith. Spain is very emotional, very expressive. Italy too. It's the same faith, but there is a certain cultural difference in the two ways of expressing it. And that's a very valid principle. So in 1659, there was a decree of the Holy See, the office of the Propaganda Fide, which said this: you must, an instruction to missionaries, you must refrain from doing or saying anything with a view to making those peoples change their rites. And by rites, it means not their liturgy, but their customs. Their customs or their manners, provided they do not blatantly oppose religion and morality. So if they have some custom or something they do that is not in opposition to religion or morality, it may be retained. What more absurd than to introduce France, Spain, or any other part of Europe into China? This is still the text of the Holy See. That is not what you have to introduce, but the faith, which, so far from rejecting or insulting rites and customs that are not in themselves evil, desires their preservation. So with that, the missionaries went out, but the Jesuits got a little carried away. And, for example, now I'm not necessarily, but just giving an example, and you could argue about this. In 1648, St. John de Brebeuf evangelized the Indians in Canada, and in the famous Christmas hymn that he wrote, he said that the three kings, we'll talk about them, brought beaver skins, because they didn't even have a word for gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So in order to show that they brought something valuable, he said they brought beaver skins. And the Jesuits in California, or the Franciscans in California, because they couldn't get through to the Indians the notion of the Trinity, actually portrayed the Trinity in their missions as three human beings, and they were condemned for that. But it was this idea that, well, we have to try something, we have to somehow make the faith known to these people who are very primitive, and there's nothing to work with here. So the intention was good, and the principle was good, but occasionally they went overboard. That was Father Ricci, the Jesuit, who was the prince of going overboard. Right? And the other, the Dominicans and the Franciscans in China, wrote back to Rome and said, this is, even some Jesuits, this is completely out of line. They are, permitting the worship of Confucius, and they're doing all of these things in the name of this decree that was put out in 1669. So they were eventually condemned for it. So that's the rest of the story. Notice he didn't oppose me on it when I said that, because he knew it was true. In 1704, there was a legate, a papal legate sent out in 1704 to investigate, and he concluded that the Jesuits were wrong. And so in 1704, Clement XI officially decided against the rites, and in the following year sent out a legate, Thomas de Tournon, to impose his will. That's right. Okay. So based on a letter from the bishop, Monsignor Legros, he condemned what the Jesuits were doing, and sent out a legate, Thomas de Tournon, to oppose his will. This young Savoyard prelate, privy chamberlain, proved so incompetent that Kang Si, who was the Chinese emperor, had placed him under house arrest at Macau, which is near Hong Kong. Those missionaries who favored the Chinese rites, meaning this accommodation, you have to read the whole, this is Daniel Ropes, the church in the 18th century, which is a common history of the church, popular history of the church. It says, those missionaries who favored the Chinese rites were brought to heel by the Constitution Ecclesiology 715, which obliged them all to take an oath of obedience to the decisions of the Holy See. The Jesuits submitted with the rest, though not without anguish and a bitter sense of frustration. In 1717, the Emperor Kang Si, furious at learning that his report had been treated with contempt and that Li Matsu, that's the name for Father Ricci, Li Matsu's practices suppressed, retorted with an edict forbidding the preaching of Christianity. In 1724, his successor expelled all missionaries, excepting only the Jesuit scientists working at Peking. Meanwhile, a second legate, Monseigneur de Metzabarbe, was sent to deal with the situation. More intelligent than Tournon, he realized that in some respects Rome had gone too far, and on his own authority he granted 8 permissions concerning the Christianization of certain Chinese rites. Benedict XIV, now this is the author, ill-informed, annulled them by the bull Ex Quo Singulari 1742. That was the end. The quarrel, which had lasted for almost 100 years, was finished. Rome had decided against the view of Father Matteo Ricci. And in the footnote it says, the Holy See's attitude towards this question of the Chinese rites remained unaltered down to our own day. The oath of obedience to the decisions of 1715 and 1742 was required of all missionaries until 1914. Death of Pius X. The question was reopened in 1939 by Pius XII and so forth. The rest of the story is that was all suppressed. But in any case, it was never the idea of ecumenism. The idea was, how are we going to teach them the faith? How far can we go in trying to draw them into the faith by speaking to them in their own languages and in their own customs? It's not the idea of participating in pagan rites. There was never any idea of that. It was simply a question of going too far with what was essentially a true principle. And finally, the business of the Magi. That was one of the most absurd things that I ever heard in my whole life. I couldn't believe that his response to my accusation of idolatry in the courtyard of Assisi was that the Magi who came to worship the true God, and the fathers are unanimous in saying that the offering of the incense was a sign of his divinity, that could be compared to the offering of homage to fire, a created thing, in the basilica or in the courtyard of the Basilica of Assisi. So when he said that, I just gave up. So that's the post-mortem on the debate. I didn't have time, as you can see, to get into all of that in the talk, but I wanted to explain all of the things that I said very perfunctorily in the talk. So if anybody has any questions now, I could take a few questions. Yes?
I'm not sure how to state this, but it's been bothering me for some time. How is it possible, and this is almost sounding like a quote from Dr. Fastiggi, and I don't mean it that way, but how is it possible that during the time of Vatican II, with all that knowledge contained in over 2,400 bishops, all of the multitude of knowledge of cardinals and all that could meet all these years, and come up with what they did? I mean, obviously it was the intent, as you have told us also, to bring in all the Protestants, to bring in the Muslims, to bring these people back into the fold of holding of the church.
a very good question. The answer is somewhat long, but be patient. First of all, the intention of Vatican II was not to convert people. It was to make a generic Christianity in which there would be reconciled diversity, and the term reconciled diversity is Ratzinger's, and it comes from Oscar Kuhlmann. That you will have, all of these particular churches and ecclesial communities, although different, reconciled. Okay? So, as I said to Dr. Fastiggi, why don't we go out and convert these people? But your own Vatican says there should be no proselytism. And he, again, absurdly said that proselytism means you shouldn't go and put a gun to their head and say, become a Catholic. That is not the definition of that. It means to try to convert somebody, if you look it up in the dictionary, to proselytize, means to try to convert. And it says right in the ecumenical directory, okay, you should not proselytize. But the only thing I can tell you about Vatican II, and to answer that question, is what Archbishop Lefebvre said about it, and he talked about it many times, is that there was this biggest single factor was that John XXIII and Paul VI were with the liberals. That any time any bishop, anybody, would get up and say, this is contrary to Catholic doctrine, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't say this. There would be these interventions and so forth, whereby Paul VI and John XXIII, especially Paul VI, would make it clear that there is no contradiction of Catholic doctrine. Now, this is not meant in any way to contradict the previous teaching. And in the general attitudes and the appointments of bishops on the various commissions and all, it was clear that he was with the progressives, he was with the liberals, the modernists. So that the bishops who were sort of in the middle, what do they call it in the election now, the undecided, or was those who were floating, figured, well, the Pope is the living rule of faith. If he says it's okay, it must be okay. Maybe I don't understand it. But it must be okay if he says it's okay. And these other bishops who are saying it's not okay, maybe they just misunderstand it. And don't forget as well that this was 1962 to 1965, that the Catholic Church was still in excellent condition. That the seminaries were all filled with seminarians, and nuns were teaching, and you still had the hangover, for lack of a better term, of the old church, all of the force and energy. Just like if a ship loses its power, it's still going to glide for a long time because of the power that it had. Or a car, if you lose power, you're going to coast for a long time. And the church was coasting from the strength of its previous decades, its previous history. See? So it was in this context of orthodoxy and the traditional Mass being offered every day. They were all going off and saying more or less the traditional Mass that we use. There were certain changes introduced during the Council, but it was still recognizable more or less as the traditional Mass. It wasn't anything like what they do now. And so just think of that context. And the idea that, well, the Pope is a heretic was just outer space. It was the planet Pluto to think that maybe Paul VI was a heretic. So that would have been the conclusion of saying, well, these bishops are right. These bishops are right when they say that religious liberty contradicts the previous teaching of the Catholic Church, which Archbishop Lefebvre got up and said. He got up and said that. Other bishops did too. It's in contradiction. So the conclusion is, well, the Pope must be a heretic. And that would be like saying, the moon is made of green cheese, or it was so remote that they were forced into the idea, well, I don't understand it, but it must be okay because after all, the Pope wants this, he's on this side. And so a lot of those bishops were pulled in that way. And in so doing, they imbibed the error. So the error then took hold in their minds, the errors of Vatican II, and corrupted their previously Catholic instincts. Now you did have a whole group of bishops there who were heretics. All of those, not every single one, but the main leaders of the French, the Germans, the Dutch, a lot of the Italians, Swiss, Austrians, blatant heretics. And they were, according to Archbishop Lefebvre, the whole council, every single morning of a session, you found in your mailbox a printout, a little flyer, a newsletter, of what you should think that day. A commentary on what was said the previous day, and what you should think about the document today. And who was doing those? Rahner, Ratzinger, Kuhn. The radicals. The radical theologians in suit and tie, priests in suit and tie, and mind you, this is back in 1962, what you should think. And so the liberal wing was highly organized. They were waiting in the wings, just like they were waiting here, just for the curtain to come back in here. They would bring out the whole show, and they moved the council that way. And you had two factors. One is that the bishops are generally not appointed for their knowledge, and they are appointed for their ability to rule. And that's why bishops typically would have with them periti, that is, experts, who would say, this is right, this is wrong, this is heresy, this is not heresy. But bishops are appointed to rule. They're appointed to be administrators of dioceses. And while they must know their theology, while they must know their doctrine, they are not necessarily theologians. They listen to people. They listen to advisors. That's the general principle. There was a term in this country for bishops before the council. They would be called brick and mortar bishops. That means that they put up 10 schools. They put up, that their whole apostolate was brick and mortar. And they were also appointed as canon lawyers. And so you would not be appointed in this country a bishop if you were a theologian before the council, because they were afraid that you could take the whole diocese. See, in this country, legally, the diocese belongs to the bishop. His signature is enough to alienate every piece of property in the whole diocese and every cent of cash. Is one signature. Right? So that means that if ever the bishops of this country went into schism, everything goes legally. That's something that is true of this country. Even before the council, the Vatican was always a little concerned about the legal situation in this country, and they would appoint canon lawyers. Canon lawyers are typically people who are not very astute theologically, but are very astute from the point of view of administration. They are lawyers. Legal things. So they're sort of blind to theological matters, and they are very easily led by their advisors. So most of those bishops sitting there, when it came to a dispute as to religious liberty and all that, they were not attuned to subtlety by any stretch of the imagination. And they were willing to follow what they perceived to be the Pope in that matter. And that's why they were let in. Now, 40 years later, when we see all of the destruction of Vatican II, and also when we contemplate Vatican II more, when we see the post-conciliar documents, such as the one I just showed you, and what they did with Vatican II, it is much more clear that, despite what whatever Paul VI said, it is a departure from Catholic teaching. Also, that's why we insist, and not a popular thing among a lot of people, but we insist that Paul VI was not a true Roman pontiff, because that preserves all of the error, it preserves the church from error. If he was in fact a heretic, then he led them all into heresy. That's the answer to that question. Why did they make all of this error? Because he led them into heresy. And the only value of a council is the Pope. You could have 100 million bishops together, and it has no power to teach in the name of the church except with the signature of the Pope. Otherwise, it's just a meeting. It doesn't have any binding force from the point of view of doctrine if it is not in union with the Roman Pontiff. So the whole force of Vatican II is the signature of the Roman Pontiff. If he is not the Roman Pontiff, that pulls the plug on that whole council. And therefore, it is not an ecclesiological problem. They were led into heresy by a heretic, and their council has no juice. So that's how it happened. And that leads me to another thing that he brought up. And that is, how can you say that all these bishops are wrong, and all, general council and all? Again, that's off the point. The point is there doctrinal continuity between pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II? That's the question. If the question to that answer is yes, then they are right, we are wrong, and all the bishops at the council were right, we are wrong. If the answer to that question is no, then, conclusion, Paul VI and all of the bishops at that council were wrong. But you can't say, well, that was a council, therefore somehow this must be right. I compare it to if a captain of a ship said, I'm going to take this ship and dash it on the rocks and sink it with all of the people on board, what would the crew do? Of course, they would tie him up and put him in the brig and take the ship over and bring it to its proper port. That's common sense. Right? That's what essentially Paul VI was doing in leading the bishops into those errors. He's saying, I'm going to take this ship of the church and dash it on the rocks. Because the essential good of the church and his primary duty as Pope, if he were to have been the Pope, would be to assure the truth of the faith, the continuity of faith. All right? What Dr. Fastiggi's argument is, well, because he's the Pope and there's so many bishops, we have to say that these are not rocks that the ship is being dashed upon. Because they are in denial. They are in denial of the discontinuity. As if he wanted to attack me, he should have said, there is continuity, and here it is. Because if there's continuity, where is it? Why are they incapable of showing it? Why do they have to bring out these extrinsic arguments, like, how can you say this about the Holy Father? I looked into his eyes, which was absurd. Looked into his eyes. Why don't we talk about the issues? Or that, how would all of these people be wrong? Well, if there is discontinuity between column 1 and column 2, then they're all wrong. And you, Dr. Fastiggi, have a big, big problem because your Pope is a heretic. That's the conclusion, the logic, the cold, clear logic. If there is not continuity between column 1 and column 2, then your Pope is a heretic. And that's the only possible conclusion. See, if you recall what I said, we cannot say that the Church has taught error. The Church is indefectible and infallible. But it is possible for human beings to defect. It is possible for Wojtyła to be a heretic. It is possible for Montini to have been a heretic. This defection is possible. It is not possible that the church, as the true church of Christ, and in its true authority, to defect, but it is possible for these human beings to defect. And it is possible for them to come up through the ranks and be elected and appointed and so forth. That is possible. It happened with Nestorius, the Archbishop of Constantinople. It happened with many other bishops who became heretics. The history of the church is full of that. It is not impossible that the person who is designated to be the Bishop of Rome be in fact a heretic. That's not impossible. So we are saying, because that's not impossible, and because we have the direct proof that there is discontinuity, we are asserting what is possible. Namely, that man is a heretic, and that he has led the Catholic faithful, including those appointed to bishops and other places, into heresy, which is a completely Catholic explanation of what is going on. But to say, well, how can they all be wrong when they are all wrong? It doesn't even address the issue. Not once did he address the issue of what I brought up, that I can recall. Not a single time did he go through my questions and address the problem of column 1 and column 2. And I think that he was a disaster for their side. I think that their own side was very poorly represented. I think I could have represented their side better than he did. I really do. I think that they fell on their faces. And if I had been those priests, I would have been terribly embarrassed. So, any other questions? Yes?
The last day or so, there was I don't know from process, but from the Vatican that came out with a certain doctrine as feminism. Have you had a chance to look at that? Any comments on it?
Yeah, that's more Queen Elizabeth. Yeah, I saw it. It's, now that, they've ruined the family by preaching feminism, by having women's liber nuns, and by preaching all of that stuff for 40 years. I mean, now they are embarrassed by the fact that women don't want to have babies, and that the European race is dying out, and that families are breaking up. After they have approved a phony marriage annulments, 50,000 per year, over the past 25 years or so, or better, after they have practically destroyed the sacrament of matrimony, now they're coming out and saying, well, the family is breaking up because of women's liberation. They have totally destroyed the Catholic culture. Catholic culture, you hear it from my pulpit about the role of mother and wife and father and husband. It's all very clear. Be subject to your husbands, St. Paul. But they destroyed all that. They destroyed it in their schools. They destroyed it in their catechisms. And then they come out and condemn it. Like everyone's going to get in line now. They're going to stop taking birth control pills. All of those. I mean, it's something like what is it? In the 80% of Catholics polled, according to legitimate polls, and this has been consistent over the years, believe that artificial birth control is okay. Now, where is the condemnation from Rome of these people? As you said, where are the excommunications? Where are they? Why don't people get excommunicated for saying that? What about all these people in these parishes that you see as you come home from church? 80% of them say artificial birth control is okay. Is that the unity of faith? Is this document going to discipline priests who are permitting all of these things and are permitting the destruction of the family? Of course not. They won't do anything. I was just reading in the Wanderer the other day. There's a bishop somewhere out in Wisconsin or Minnesota who is appointing as a pastor of a church a priest that had been arrested recently not too long ago, for soliciting, to be modest, let's say improper activity with another man. The charges were dropped because the police determined that it was consensual. He is now being made the pastor of a parish, and the whole idea is that you should forgive and forget. And they're talking about, it's just absurd. It's absurd that that could happen. Imagine, could you just imagine that such a priest should be defrocked. He should be something away. You should never see that man again. That's what should be done in those cases. So, these things that come out from the Vatican occasionally that, sound conservative or traditional, they are pure lip service. Nothing is ever done. The ship continues to sink. There is more and more scandal, and horrid bishops continue to be appointed. Those that are already horrid continue to be maintained in their places. And life goes on. Life goes on. I mean, how could you ever appoint as a pastor of a parish someone who was arrested as a public act, soliciting improper behavior with another man? Can you even think about it? So, that's my comment on it. It really means nothing, and they are just concerned about the damage that they themselves have done, and it's embarrassing to them, and they are just trying to save themselves. Anybody else?
I just have a real quick question, Your Excellency. Could you explain what precisely the magisterium, as was referred by yourself and Dr. Fastiggi, what does the magisterium specifically mean? What is the team? Is it a combination of canon law, dogma, church teaching, or is there a precise way?
Yes, it has a very precise definition. Magisterium in Latin means teaching, and it refers, first of all, to the act of teaching. And secondly, and it's more common meaning, is what is taught. You see? So, taking it in its first sense, the church teaches magisterium. That is, authoritative teaching to which you must give the assent of faith in two ways. One is by extraordinary magisterium, which is the Pope teaching ex cathedra, which means a solemn definition of the Pope, where he says, I declare, I define, and other language like that. And it doesn't matter whether it's in an encyclical or a bull or anything, he needs to use certain language. It must be contained, by the way, in Revelation. So if he says something that is not contained in Revelation, it does not deserve the assent of faith, but we must submit to it. We cannot disagree with it. We must accept it as we would accept teaching from a teacher. But it is not the same thing as the assent of divine faith. See? So that's the first way, is what we call extraordinary magisterium. The other type of extraordinary magisterium is the teaching of a general council in union with the Pope. When they say, we declare, we define, and so forth. So not everything that the Council of Trent, for example, said is extraordinary magisterium. It's only when you hear that language, we say this in the Holy Ghost, or we affirm, there's the idea of making something clear, not the mere general teaching. The other is what we call ordinary universal magisterium, and Pope Pius XI or XII said that happens every day, and that is the general teaching of the Church by its bishops in union with the Pope. And this happens by way of preaching. It happens by way of the use of catechisms that are approved by the local bishop in union with the Pope. So if you find something universally taught throughout the whole world by the Pope and by the bishops, by mere preaching or by catechesis, by the approval of books used in seminaries and things like that, just the ordinary process of teaching, it is the teaching of the church and binds us by faith. An example is guardian angels. There is no extraordinary definition or solemn definition of guardian angels, but if I got up and gave a sermon on October 2nd, there's no such thing as guardian angels. I think most of you would get up and walk out, and rightfully so, because I would be denying something which pertains to ordinary and universal magisterium of the church. Another thing that is taught by ordinary universal magisterium is the moral teaching of the church. There is no place that says abortion is wrong in extraordinary magisterium. There's no place that says murder is wrong. There's no place that says stealing is wrong. These things are taught by what we call, there's no place in extraordinary magisterium. Those things are taught by ordinary magisterium. They are taught from the pulpit. They are taught in catechisms. And this is the way that the church teaches most of the time. As a matter of fact, there was no solemn declaration, no extraordinary magisterium until the year 325 AD. So for 300 years almost, all you had was the general teaching of the Catholic Church. Yet when Arius denied the divinity of Christ, he was considered a heretic before the definition of the Council of Nicaea. So was Nestorius considered a heretic by denying the fact that Mary was the mother of God before the definition of Ephesus in 431. The clergy got out, and the people too, got up and walked out on Christmas Day. He got up and said, "We will no longer refer to Mary as the mother of God." The people got up and walked out of the church. And the clergy with them, and there he was with a few of his followers left in this big church. That was Constantinople. A very great see of the church. And we are walking out. See? And that has strong precedent in the history of the Catholic Church. It's just in this century of mush and subjectivism that people just sit there and do nothing and take it. Of indifference to religion, weakness. St. Pius X said that the greatest enemy of the church is the weakness of Catholics. He has a beautiful quote. Mr. Brownie just told it to me the other day. He has it memorized. It's a beautiful quote. But essentially, it is the weakness of good Catholics that is the greatest enemy of the church. And that is true today. Look at how few Catholics, if you consider all of the mass centers in the Detroit area, they might all add up to maybe, even if you include everybody, all kinds of, Society of St. Pius X included everybody that is striving against Vatican II. It might add up to 1,000 people in a diocese of over 1 million. That's what, 1%? Maybe you'd get 1,000 people. It's a terrible testimony. Terrible testimony to Catholics. And which brings us to something Mrs. Fisher said, and that is the great apostasy from the faith. See, their big thing is, to us, what you are saying is enormous. Oh, how can you say the Pope and all these bishops have defected? And what you're saying is enormous. The whole thing is collapsed. Everything is terrible. That's enormous. And yes, it is enormous. I agree with that. But what is more enormous is that these two things don't agree. This column and this column. Because then you have a defected church. And that is more enormous than having many millions of Catholics defect. Why? Because they are capable of defection. But the Catholic Church, because it is assisted by Christ, is not capable of defection. So what they're saying is more enormous. To say that the captain has decided to dash the ship on the rocks is enormous, and that we have to tie him up and throw him in the brig. That's enormous. Yes, I agree. And that all of the officers with him too. Yes, that's enormous. I agree. But it is more enormous that that ship be dashed upon the rocks and that it sink That's more enormous. And so what they're trying to convince us of is something that is impossible and far more enormous than anything we're saying. And they never address continuity. Does that answer your question? Defining the magisterium. Yes?
I have relatives on both sides of my family, in-laws and on my side, that they, essentially stick with the Novus Ordo out of peer pressure, and they're afraid to get up and walk out. Because if they get up to walk out, then they're going to, if they're going to be on the outside and nobody, will associate with them, they'll be, afraid.
That's known as the Thomas More syndrome. All right? What are we going to love more, the king or God? And if we want to keep our heads attached to our neck, we better love the king more than God. And it is essentially to love human things, human beings, created things more than God. It's an old story. And there was only a few people put to death in England for the faith, and most of them went over to loving the king more than God. It's an old story. Yes?
I was wondering, I know there was no time on July 19th, but I was wondering if the matter was ever discussed privately, or would you feel it would be a good argument for the future to hear his opinion, or hear him try to defend why Vatican II hands out annulments like candy, when it was never heard of prior to Vatican II. I'd like to hear him try to defend that.
Me or him?
Him. I know you can do it.
I really
I mean,
don't.
it's just appalling to me. It's a huge black eye.
Yeah, their response would be progress in the science of psychology. That the reason why these annulments are handed out now is because we know more about psychology, and that when young people come together and decide to be married, that they are not really fully cognizant of what they're doing, and they can easily make mistakes, and later on they realize the mistakes they made, and therefore they were psychologically immature. Most of those are handed out for psychological immaturity, that's what they call it. That's what he would say, They have a response for everything. It makes a shambles and a farce of the sacrament of matrimony. But, for them, it all has to hold up. As the building has collapsed, just like 9/11, the thing has come down. But they are picturing it as all up. See, that for them, no matter what you bring up about Vatican II, what Mrs. Erling brought up about these ladies without tops on dancing around in front of John Paul II, and he said, you can't believe everything you read in the New York Times. And the Pope doesn't have the ability to control what goes on at those masses. He could get up and walk out. He could do that. Are we supposed to take this seriously and believe these explanations? Even if you asked him, he would give you, I believe, a really dumb response. And he came up with some really stupid things the other night. And I think he would give you just that. Then the next question is, who's really married? Because you could make an argument for anybody where, well, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was in love, and I was this, and I was that. Well, who's married? If you admit those principles, you could annul any marriage. And there was a priest on the diocese, on the marriage tribunal of the Diocese of Brooklyn, who said, there is no marriage that I cannot annul. It's a quote. And it makes sense. Because that's why when you go to get married, you go through that questionnaire. Do you freely want to marry this person? Do you know what you're doing? Is anyone forcing you? Are you completely free? And you sign, you actually swear to the truth of that? So that if you come back and say to us, I didn't know what I was doing, and somebody was forcing me, the paper comes out. You sign this. This is why we ask you these questions. So it is all a farce and a sham. And any response that he would give you is going to be, in some way, to protect the farce and the sham. It's the emperor's new clothes. The emperor is as buck naked, but he has beautiful clothes on. Don't you see that? Mr. Belladilla.
Will there be another debate between yourself?
Father Ben and Courtney, seminarian, came by the other day, dropped in on me unexpectedly, and asked me about that, and I said, I don't want to go up again against Dr. Fastiggi. It's just a waste of time. It's just, we never, in either of those debates or those discussions, never got on the issue. He attacked me personally, not that it doesn't bother me in itself, but it bothers me from the point of view of debating. That why are we here? Even if I am arrogant, even if I am dishonest, that has nothing to do with the issues. If I'm dishonest and arrogant, fine, let's talk about the issues. And for him to have descended into that, this shows that it's a waste of time. And usually it's a sign that you're losing the argument if you're attacking your opponent in person. But it has nothing to do with it. Even if I am dishonest, even if I am arrogant, even if I'm a schismatic, even if I'm a heretic, even if I'm going to hell, that has nothing to do with the issues at hand. So I just said to them that I just feel that he cannot think abstractly. Somebody said that to me. Yes. I said to them, he cannot think abstractly, and it's true. So that to Father Ben. He is incapable of really addressing ecclesiology. He comes up with all of these extrinsic arguments, like looking into the JP2's eyes. And they laugh at that too. So, give me a break. His eyes. And he's alone. And but they said, well, would you like to do anything? I said, sure. And I said, I would like to see a personal discussion among the priests. Just their priests and me, and if I can get somebody else, fine. But a personal discussion, because I think that would be of more use. My personal opinion, I think that I have made a dent in that clergy. I think that I have given them something to think about. I think the interest is more than simply talking. I don't know, I just sense that. I think that I've made them think, at least. And that's why I want to do it on that level. I wouldn't want to, see, he was working the crowd. I don't know if you noticed that. Yeah. He was there to convert you back to the Novus Ordo. You're all going to hell. You're all schismatics. You're following this evil man. All of this stuff. And I know most of you just laughed at that because it's not true. And he didn't win a single convert from all of that he said. I think that he confirmed the errors of the Novus Ordo in your minds. I think that's what he did. That he could not address a single decent defense of my accusations. Not a single one. Go ahead.
As a follow-up question, is there a chance fellowship out of year?
Well, one of the things that was mentioned the other day is that if we have these discussions, that the Cardinal Secretary wants to come. And, that's what they mentioned. That if the Cardinal Secretary is going to be there, I'm going to insist that Father Cicada come. Because Father Cicada has a very quick mind, and he's funny. And I am neither of those things. And as a matter of fact, when I told him about the Magi thing, he says he's probably one of the few modernists that believe that the Magi exist. He says most of them say that the Magi were fairy tales made up in the 4th century. You see, I knew that, but it comes to his mind right away. And if he had said that, or if he would say that that would make everyone laugh. He's very funny. And when you're funny like that, you make a point very clearly. When you do it with humor, the point is very well made, and I would just like to have him there. So I have to go down to see both Bishop Dolan and Father Cicada this week, and I'm going to insist. I'd like to get Bishop Dolan up too, because Bishop Dolan has a wonderful sharp tongue, and we always kid him about it. So there's a verse in the Psalm, "Acutum fecisti dolum," which is you have it literally means you have made the deception very sharp, the dolum, or the trap very dark, very sharp. "Acutum fecisti dolum." And we always turn it and say, "Acutum fecisti dolum," which means you have made dolum very sharp. And he has he can put a good comment in very, very well from time to time. So I think that the three of us would make a good team with a bunch of them. I think my forte would be the deeper theology of it. In other words, I can see where the errors are and so forth, but I'm more slow-moving than either Father Giuliano or Bishop Pellet. So I think we would make a good team. If the Cardinal Secretary will be there, I think we should respond in kind. Mr. Penal,
I just have a sort of anecdote about that. I was talking to Fastiggi, who was very good at applying multiple definitions to single words. And finally, when I realized he was too slippery like the greased pig at the little country carnival, I said, well, you really must admit that the New York Times wouldn't just print something so false like that. He goes, yeah. And I said, by the way, I said, if we go out for a drink after this, and I took you to a bar where the impurely dressed woman, where I said topless bar, I said, what would you do? And he said, I'd walk out. And I go, what? Then what about the Pope? And that was the only time he had a pregnant pause in the conversation. There was just the silence. And he didn't have this spew of whatever he was going to, he always had something to come back. That was the only time I had him cornered enough so he stopped.
don't forget that he is an employee of the Archdiocese, and he cannot say that is a horrible scandal. He cannot say that.
But at least he did finally get it.
Yes, I think the pregnant pause was we were supposed to fill in the blanks. This will be the last one for somebody else. I would. Okay. Yes.
I just want to ask you, you said something about the continuance of your discussion would be on a personal basis, so that they would not be open to the parishioners?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, I wouldn't mind it being open to parishioners. I think it's a good thing. I think it just like what this is. It's just that if the goal is to convert them, or even to make them think, I think that goal is better served by my private discussion with them. At least at this point, maybe down the line, if they can come up with somebody who would stick to the issues, I would do it again. But not with Dr. Fastiggi. I'm not going to go through that. So anyway, okay, well, thank you for coming. Next week, if you want to come, we'll do, it'll be a series, and I put in the bulletin why John Paul II cannot be the Pope. That requires a big exposition. I'd like to tape it, actually. It requires a big exposition of certain principles. You only have about 20 minutes in a sermon, and you're talking about something which is enormous. But based on a lot of the things that I have said here, I want to show you the two big arguments, which are two really separate arguments, and also that whole business about total versus material formal vacancy, which is an important issue because, as you may know, I hold to material formal vacancy. In other words, that he is materially the Pope, but formally not. That means he has designation to be the Pope, but in fact he doesn't have the authority, and he's not a true Pope. I hold to that because it answers the question of, which was the first question that they put to me, in fact, what's the solution for the Church in your view? See, so I want to explain all that.
Yeah.